Assalamu alaikum. Quran Quiz. Let's play. How well do you know the surahs? Which surah is called Chapter of the Striking Calamity? Al-Qari'ah. Surah Al-Qari'ah is Surah 101 of the Quran and has 11 ayahs. Which surah does not begin with Bismillah? At-Tawbah. Surah At-Tawbah is the only surah in the Quran that does not begin with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Which surah contains two sajda verses close together? Al-Hajj. Surah Al-Hajj contains two verses of prostration, sajda, ayahs 18 and 77. Which surah is called Chapter of the Clot? Al-Alaq. Surah Al-Alaq 96 1-5 contains the first verses of the Quran revealed to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Which surah is called Chapter of the Earthquake? Az-Zalzala. Surah Az-Zalzala describes the great earthquake of the earth on the Day of Judgment. Which surah contains the story of Qarun? Al-Qasas. Surah Al-Qasas contains the story of Qarun and how his immense wealth ultimately led to his downfall. Which surah is called Chapter of the Sun? Ash-Shams. Ash-Shams means the sun. The surah begins with Allah swearing by the sun and its brightness. Which surah contains two Bismillah, one inside the surah? An-Naml. Surah An-Naml contains Bismillah twice, once at the beginning and once in Ayah 30 in the letter of Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam to the Queen of Sheba. Which surah is called Chapter of the Night? Al-Layl. Al-Layl means the night. The surah begins with Allah swearing by the night as it covers the day. Which surah mentions the name Ramadan? Al-Baqarah. Surah Al-Baqarah 185 is the only place in the Quran where the name Ramadan is mentioned. Which surah begins with by the dawn? Al-Fajr. Surah Al-Fajr begins with Allah swearing by the dawn, 89:1. Which surah is named after a metal? Al-Hadid. Al-Hadid means the iron. Surah Al-Hadid is the only surah in the Quran named after a metal. Which surah is called Chapter of the City? Al-Balad. Al-Balad means the city. The surah refers to Makkah, the sacred city, in its opening verses. Which surah contains Ayatul Kursi? Al-Baqarah. Ayatul Kursi is Ayah 255 of Surah Al-Baqarah and is described in an authentic hadith as the greatest verse in the Quran. Which surah is called Chapter of the Most High? Al-A'la. Surah Al-A'la, Surah 87, begins by glorifying Allah the Most High. Which surah begins with disjointed letters Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Sad? Maryam. Surah Maryam is named after Maryam, the mother of Prophet Isa, alayhi salam. Which surah is called Chapter of the Night Visitor? At-Tariq. Surah At-Tariq describes the night visitor as a bright, piercing star. Which surah has the longest ayah in the Quran? Al-Baqarah. Ayah 282 of Surah Al-Baqarah is the longest ayah in the Quran. It is known as Ayat ad-Dain, the verse of debt. Which surah is called Chapter of the Constellations? Al-Buruj. Surah Al-Buruj begins with an oath by the sky containing the great constellations. Which surah is called the protector from punishment of the grave? Al-Mulk. Surah Al-Mulk is mentioned in narrations as a surah that intercedes for its reciter. Which surah is called Chapter of the Cleaving? Al-Infitar. Surah Al-Infitar describes the splitting of the sky on the Day of Judgment. Which surah is known as the Chapter of the Opening? Al-Fatiha. Surah Al-Fatiha is recited in every unit, rak'ah, of the daily prayer. Which surah is called Chapter of the Tidings? An-Naba. Surah An-Naba has 40 ayahs and focuses on the day of resurrection and the great news. Which surah contains the story of the sleepers of the cave? Al-Kahf. Surah Al-Kahf tells the story of the young believers who sought refuge in a cave and slept there for many years. Which surah is called Chapter of the Overwhelming Event? Al-Ghashiyah. Surah Al-Ghashiyah describes scenes from the Day of Judgment and the fate of people in paradise and hell. Thank you. Like, share, and subscribe.